Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's ground pork seminar. I am Myrna Welter, a pork producer from Stewartville, and I serve as a director on the Minnesota Pork Board. In recent years, many pork producers have identified ground pork as a growth opportunity to grow per capita pork consumption. From pork burgers to tacos, and meatballs to egg rolls, in a bowl of versatility, flavor, and affordability of ground pork make it an excellent option for consumers. Neal Hull, Director of Domestic Market Development for the National Pork Board, has worked closely with Hy-Vee and Hormel to implement a test and learn plot centered around ground pork. The information that this program discovered will be utilized in different retailers across the country to help drive merchandising best practices for pork products in the meat case. Please help me in welcoming Neal Hull.
Thank you. Well, I'm excited to talk to you guys about ground pork this afternoon. It's been something that's been very close to my heart, and it's fun to represent that for producers. And the work that I represent here today, it's a team effort, it's a collaborative effort at the National Pork Board, and it's all made on behalf of the Pork Checkoff. So we're investing your hard-earned checkoff dollars and really making an impact in the marketplace. So raise your hand if something on the slide looks like, hey, I got a question on that, and we can certainly open it up for questions when we get to the end. Antitrust statement was in here. I don't know that we've got competitors in the room, but I'll just pause for a second because that's always important. We're not going to talk about pricing or competitive activity. And really what we've started down the path on is this idea of leading the industry through influence. And what I've said many times is I can't make a retailer, I can't make a food service company, I can't make anybody do anything they don't want, but I can influence them, right? We can use consumer insights and we can influence the work that they're doing. And really that is what ground pork has led us to, right? We're building the story for pork, we're unlocking this growth potential, and we're really making our protein, the pork protein, matter. So what our work revealed was ground pork has room to grow. And I've been with the National Pork Board for 3.5 years. I've talked to a lot of producers. I've had some people say, well, what's different this time, right? We've been talking about ground pork for a long time, and I will tell you, everything is different this time. We've grounded it in research. We've grounded it in the consumer. And one of the exciting things is, as you think about how do you get more ground pork on the shelf, we've really got to figure out, well, what's going to have to move out? And through a lot of consumer research, we found out that plant-based, consumers really don't envision that plant-based belongs in the fresh meat case. So that was part of our test that, you can raise some applause there. So that's one of the things that we tested out, and I'll share the results as we get a little further into the deck. So really, how did we do it? And we really built a case for the case. And our process, and really I'm not going to read each bullet point, but it's all this, it's the idea of how do we build trust and add value. So we're leading through influence. We've been able to meet with packers. We've taken this consumer research that they overlay, and we've met with retailers and shown them, here's the opportunity. And I will tell you, we were starting down the path of presenting to retailers. We kind of had this hypothesis of what might work. And I said, wait a second, I think we've got to test this out, right? We've got to be able to prove to somebody that it works. So we identified the retailer. We'll talk about it in just a little bit. Just a quick history on the meat department, right? Pre-pandemic, basically business was relatively flat. We had pork that was down in dollars. We were down a little less than 1% on pounds. And then the pandemic hit. And the pandemic, one shining piece from the pandemic was it was really good for protein and it was really good for pork. We've seen great growth. In 2020, we saw dollars up 19% on pork, and we saw volume up almost 12%. So you think about that, after being flat or down a little bit, and then to see a spike of 12%. So then you say, okay, what happened in 2021? Well, in 2021, you'd see volumes down 8.7. But that was after a record year for pork and for the meat department. So I always like to look at through the lens of, so what's happened since the start of the pandemic? And we're up 1.5% on pork. Dollars are up 8.5%. Part of that's inflation. But the reality is people have a high affinity for meat, and they have a high affinity for pork. So that's the good news. We're continuing to hold on to those consumers. And what we did was we looked through the lens of, we've had a lot of younger consumers come to the category. People have shopped deeper into the set. How do we keep a hold of them, right? How do we keep them in the family of pork? So we identified as ground pork as one of those, because really grinds were the shining star. And I remember having conversations early on in the pandemic, and it was like, well, maybe ground pork's growing because it's the only thing in the meat case. Well, we all know, I've seen pictures of it where plant-based was the only thing that was left in the meat case. But ground pork, the pandemic gave consumers the opportunity to shop ground pork. And they tried it, and guess what? They liked it. And we've done a lot of research to say, okay, were they pantry loading? Were they putting it in the freezer? The research shows that they were using it within 2 or 3 days. And 9 out of 10 consumers that tried it were going to try it again. And the cool part is over half of the households that bought ground pork during 2020 hadn't bought it in the previous years. So it was a new consumer that came to the category. So we started thinking about, how do we get to pork's fair share? Because everybody's been to stores. Ground pork's hard to find if you can find it at all. Sometimes it's relegated to the top shelf in the corner. I got a couple pictures that I'll show you. Sometimes it's out of stock. Example, I was at Walmart in Austin, Minnesota on Sunday to get some stuff to make pork pot stickers, and they didn't have any ground pork. So there's still a lot of work to do, but there's been really good work. And we identified 4 areas that we really needed to focus on. One was consistent distribution, right? How do you make sure that it's an everyday item on the shelf? Making sure that it has the right placement on the shelf. And then the shelf presence, right? So instead of one facing, our goal was, how do we get to 2 facings? How do we get to 3 facings? How do we get product on 2 shelves? And then this idea of choice versus take it or leave it. Typically, when you shop ground beef, there's 73 lean, there's 80 lean, there's 85, there's 90, there's 93. On ground pork, typically it's one item. A lot of times it doesn't even call out the fat to lean ratio. So we're doing lots of work as we meet with the packers, and we've got a couple packers working on new lean contents to add to the case. So those were the 4 areas that we really identified that we wanted to pursue. And we talked to consumers about, where would you expect to find it? If you're going to shop for ground pork in the grocery store, where would you expect to find it? And the majority of people said, I would expect it to be with fresh ground meat. And you can see some verbatims from consumers because it's where all the other ground meats are. It's easy to make a comparison. I can compare prices. And the one thing that we're trying to reinforce on ground pork is it can be subbed in. So if you're using ground beef, you can use ground pork. If you're making chili, you can go half and half. I mean, the opportunities are endless. So really we talked about this idea of a block set. And a block set, think about it as when you walk up, and I've got some pictures of it, it would just be a block set. So you've got all the grinds together. So this is the journey that we've been on. And I preface, it's a journey. There's a lot of work yet to be done on ground pork, but we really started with the why, right? What is the concept? And then we went through all the consumer research and said, okay, we want to figure out all these things that the consumers are looking for. We identified the opportunity. We went out and met with all of the major packers and processors and talked about the opportunity on ground pork. Some are further ahead than others, but we had those conversations. And then we started having retailer meetings, and that's when I paused and said, okay, we really need a real-world example to demonstrate that this works. So we'll talk a little bit about Hy-Vee. I'll mention Meijer briefly. They're a retailer out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, that we've currently got a test going on right now. So really it's this idea of, we thought ground pork could be more. We're bringing the players to the table. So it's the packer, the retailer, and the National Pork Board at the table talking about the opportunity, and then really connecting for long-term growth. What belongs where, making sure we've got the right items, and then how do you make that shopping experience better for the consumer? So we use ground pork as our way to drive additional value, and our conversations focused around 4, I call them business insights. It's really consumer insights, but we really wanted to dig deep on the consumer. So the first one was, plant-based success cannot be read by the buzz. Everybody here, plant-based is growing, great guns and all of that. The opportunity is different than what you might think. So every year at the annual meat conference, there's a presentation called The Power of Meat. which is one of the highlights of the program. And Anne-Marie Roehring from 210 Analytics always has a slide, and I love the slide, so I stole it from her with her permission. But it's really, this is the perspective when you start thinking about plant-based. The meat department is $84.2 billion on an annual basis. And this is drawn to scale. You'll see what I mean when I get to the end. So of that, total pork is $14 billion. So that includes fresh and processed. Then fresh pork is $7 billion. So a small percentage, but a good piece of the pie. There's refrigerated plant-based. Right? It's just shy of $500 million. So while the indexes have been really, really strong the last 3 or 4 years, big indexes on a small base is still a relatively small number. So one of the opportunities, we went to the retailer and said, okay, if we can move plant-based out of the way and add in ground pork, there's the opportunity to prove it out. So the second insight is the plant-based consumer is not the red meat consumer. They are not interchangeable. If somebody's a plant-based consumer, they're typically not a red meat consumer. So if somebody's shopping for plant-based, they're probably not going to pick up beef or pork, and vice versa. And really what we found out through the research was plant-based really aligns well with poultry. And a lot of the times it was on the frozen side of poultry, but ground chicken, turkey ingredient cuts, turkey thighs, and ground turkey. So that was an important insight that we took to the retailers. Consumers try plant-based, but their affinity remains with meat, right? And if meat didn't shine in the pandemic, I mean, that's the one thing that really shone through was this fact that people have a high affinity for real meat protein. So there, just the next couple of slides. Plant-based ranks last upon love of eating. So this is a question of what, from a meat affinity standpoint, I love eating this. Look what's at the absolute bottom, plant-based, right? People don't love eating it. You've got 8 pork cuts that fall in above it. This is total meat, and then if you just look at processed, look at where bacon is. I mean, this country has a love affair with bacon, right? It's everywhere. People love bacon. And it's an indulgent item. So this is, again, some of the insights that we shared with the retailers. And then if you look at day parts, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, plant-based falls at the bottom, right? It's the least consumed on any day part. And really, consumers are more likely to eat no protein than to eat plant-based. So think about that for a second. They're more likely to not eat protein than to eat plant-based. And we own bacon. We've owned bacon for a long, long time with bacon and sausage. Where we've got work to do is in lunch and dinner, and ground pork falls perfectly into that. Household penetration, this is just another slide we've shared with retailers. Household penetration growth has slowed, and we're actually starting to see declines in products per trip and the annual buy rates. So people have tried it. Maybe the affinity is not there, so they're not coming back and buying it again. And this one really rings true, because what I found with working with Hy-Vee and being in stores and doing resets is it's almost like they wanted permission to move it, but they didn't think they could. And what we were able to do through the research was give them the permission to move plant-based. This is just another slide that talks about, it basically rates all the proteins on a lot of different levels. So tastes delicious, love eating, good value for the money, I crave it. I mean, plant-based is on the bottom of all of those really important metrics. And that's one of the things that we try to reinforce all the time with pork is it tastes good, it's flavorful, it's nutritious, it's part of a healthy diet. I think we get the negative halo from a health standpoint because of bacon, right? So people associate that all pork's bad. That's one thing that we'll continue to work on using your checkoff dollars. And then the last insight that we would take to retailers is the fact that the pork shopper is very valuable to their business. And here's what I mean by that. The pork shopper, the average basket is higher. So we'll talk to a retailer and say, when you have a shopper in your stores with pork in the basket, that shopper is worth more to you, which means you should focus on that pork shopper. How do you get more pork? How do you get them to go from just buying pork chops to buying tenderloin? How do you get them to add ribs? How do you get them to add ground pork? And those are the things that you look at. Our household penetration is 80%, plant-based is 16%, right? And then our repeat households are 82% versus just over 50%. So again, building that story with the retailer of here's the reason why, and let us test it out. So Bill Eben, who's the CEO at the National Pork Board, coined the term. He said, let's de-risk it for the retailer, right? Because probably somebody's not going to say, you know what, we're going to take you for your word, let's go do it. So what we did with Hy-Vee is we identified 35 stores. They were in Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska. Pam, I don't know if you stayed. Pam, are you in here? So Pam from the Minnesota Pork Board, we engaged with Iowa Pork, we engaged with Nebraska Pork, and we engaged with Minnesota Pork to help with the store set. So, I mean, when I say it was a team effort, it was a complete team effort. I did a lot of store sets. Some were easier than others. Some stores were more willing to do it than others, but at the end of the day, it was a really exciting test to be part of. And there were really 4 things that we were trying to measure, and we broke it into 2 buckets. There were 2 primary things, and one was we had to expand the offerings of ground pork. And whether that's adding new items or expanding the facings. Everybody know what a facing is at the grocery store? So if you walk up to the shelf and there's 1 row of ground pork, that's 1 facing. What we wanted to do was go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6, and I'll show you some pictures of that. The next part was creating that grind set, and we talked a little bit about that. We talk about ensuring proper adjacencies. I will tell you, out of the 35 stores, we probably had 33 of them that did a great job of ensuring proper adjacencies. I probably reset 20 of the stores myself because, man, I'm passionate about this project, and if you can't tell it, it was just one of those things. And if plant-based was already out of the meat case, they would say, well, I'll go get it, it's in the freezer. I'm like, no, it's okay, leave it over there, right? So we didn't want them to add it back in, but what we did is we said, let's move plant-based from grinds, and if it's in the meat case, let's put it what Hy-Vee called last in line. So put it down with turkey and chicken. So if you think about the meat case, typically it runs grinds, then beef, then pork, then poultry, and we put plant-based down on the end. And I've got visuals of all of this. So really, those were the 4 things that we were measuring with the test at Hy-Vee. And it was a 16-week test, so it started in July. It wrapped up right before Thanksgiving, and then in the meantime, we've been analyzing the data and trying to put the story together. So the reality of the shelf, and this is a typical Hy-Vee store, right? You see ground pork, there's 2 facings all the way up in the left-hand corner. There's no way somebody's just going to pick that up because, oh, that looks good, I think I'll try it, right? It's hidden up in the corner. So that's one of the things where we said, look at all the facings of beef. If we could take a little bit, and I will tell you, I had a conversation with one of the biggest retailers on the planet. I'm not going to say their name, but you can probably figure it out. And the buyer asked me, he said, do you really think you can become ground beef? And I said, I have no interest in becoming ground beef. I just want a percent of what they got, right? If I can take 1%, 2%, 3%, that's a huge win for pork. So this is what a store, and this happens to be Mason City number 2 because it's a store that I did. So you saw there were no ground pork items in the grind set. You had 6 facings of plant-based and then kind of a hodgepodge. I spent 6 hours in this store. The shelves were a mess. We rearranged a lot of stuff. Here's what the pork set looked like when I got there that day. There were 2 facings of ground pork on the top shelf. The meat manager was like, hey, I didn't know you were coming today. And I'm like, well, I'm here. And he goes, I'm leaving in 5 minutes. And I said, well, in 5 minutes, let's agree on what I'm going to do. I said, I'm going to reset the case. I'm going to do this. And he goes, sounds great. Have fun. And left. And I spent the whole day. And as I was doing it, the assistant manager would come out and say, hey, you need a cup of coffee. And then he was like, wow, this looks really cool. It did look really cool. It's one of the proudest pieces of work I've done in the retail setting. So this is that same case where you saw the 6 facings of plant-based with no ground pork. Now all of a sudden there's 11 facings of ground pork in that set. And we created a ribbon, right, where it's a destination. It's easy to shop. And then the stores that have Johnsonville, Johnsonville has a great presence with brats and Italian sausage, so those run right next to it. So combined, there's 26 facings of pork in the grind set. And then this is what the fresh pork set looked like. Remember what it looked like before where there were empty shelves and whatnot? This is what it looked like. So it's really about securing our position in the case to make sure that it's easy to shop for that consumer. One of the challenges with not just Hy-Vee, but most retailers is not all stores are created equal. They have different linear feet of shelving, they have different units, so that creates a bit of a challenge where you could have places where pork was hard to find, but creating that ribbon, and this is a different store, but start to see that consistency of what the shelf presence looked like, and then as that consumer's there shopping, it's really easy to find. So this is that same set, taking a look down the case. So where plant-based was right here with poultry, now it's way down at the end. And it wasn't the idea of how do we help them sell more plant-based, it was how do we get plant-based out of the way so we can sell more pork. We also did some case dividers, which was a fun project to work on because we really wanted to call out, we wanted to create the set. The buyer at Hy-Vee said, I want it so these guys don't move it, right? So with the case dividers, and I will tell you, I've been probably in 10 of the 35 test stores. It ended before Thanksgiving. The sets are still in place, which if that's not an indication that it worked, then I don't know what is. So those dividers are still in the store. You'll notice that there's rail strips where we had QR code where they could scan, takes them to a collection of recipes. It's really all about meal inspiration. How do you give people ideas how to use the product? It's not just about pork burgers anymore. One of the highest searched Google terms in 2020 was egg roll in a bowl. What's the key ingredient in egg roll in a bowl? Ground pork. I've made it 100 times. So we presented the results to Hy-Vee 2 weeks ago. And as I sit down with the National Pork Board team, the team from IRI, we worked with IRI because I wanted this to be a third-party, non-biased report out. I didn't want it to be self-serving to say, hey, pork's saying that this is what you should do. So IRI is one of those third-party companies. Every time you go to the grocery store and you scan, retailers sell that information to IRI. And then IRI has all of that data. So we wanted it to be a very non-biased, results-driven type item. This is the slide that we stopped at in the meeting with Hy-Vee. Because I told everybody, I'm like, I know Jason, we've talked multiple times, it's working well, we don't have to sell hard. 20 minutes in, I landed on this slide and we stopped selling. So basically when we did the test and learn, you had 35 test stores, and then IRI identified another 35 control stores. So each test store had a control store that mirrored sales, right? So we could kind of track the data. And you can see, so you got 70 stores on this chart. Prior to the test, they were all trending basically in the similar position. When we put the new set in, this is the cool part. Look at the light blue line, how it's separated. They still followed a similar trajectory, but the test stores outperformed the control stores. That's money in the bank for a retailer, right? And that's why we wanted to put it into their language. Here's how we, as the National Pork Board, through the pork checkoff, can help you make more money. So sales dollars grew 19.2%. And somebody was like, well, that's okay. And I said, well, let's go back. That's 19.2% on top of that 19.8% in 2020, on top of 14.8% in 2021 prior to the test. So what we have done is we have accelerated that category for Hy-Vee. We stopped at that slide and I said, when do we roll it out to all the stores? And I'll share that with you in just a second. But we didn't stop there. There's more. So we also did a study through IRI to understand where consumers thought plant-based, where they thought ground pork should be in the set. So we had 1,000 participants. We went across generations. We had Gen Z and millennials, Gen X and boomers. We talked about pork consumers, beef consumers, poultry, dual, flexitarians, and we also had African American, Asian, Caucasian, Hispanic, and multiple income levels, because we really wanted to understand, okay, where do people expect to find plant-based? So in this test, they had 5 scenarios to pick from. And there were questions like, okay, if you're shopping, which one would be the easiest to shop? And I know that's really small, but this is the one that won. And it's where all meat cuts plus ground and patty versions of these meat cuts without plant-based alternatives. So they anticipate that plant-based belongs in the freezer with Boca burgers and some of those items that have been around for 25 years. So this is the information that we're taking out to retailers. And then really it's helping retailers to meet the shoppers where they are, right? 34% say that it should be in the freezer set. In the case with refrigerated meat is relatively low. And then we also ask the question, okay, if we could have more space, what would you buy more of if you were a consumer? Pork chops would motivate purchase, followed by ribs and tenderloins. So again, it started as a ground pork project, but it's really about how do we add value and create demand for pork cuts across the board. So we continue to take this information out. So what's it all mean? We've got the story, right? It's a big win for pork. It's a big win for ground pork. We're going to continue to use the data. We've got retailers that are interested. We've had a retailer in Florida that's reached out 4 times. When are you going to have that information to share with us? We've got a meeting with them on the 14th of March. I've got a meeting with another one of the top 5 retailers on March 3rd. Elaine and I, who is one of my colleagues, we're going to fly to Michigan and spend a day with the retailer in Michigan, which is Meijer, which I mentioned we had another test and learn. Another piece of this that I haven't even touched on was this idea of choice versus take it or leave it. So Meijer has added, they had an 80-10, they added a 90-10. Or they had an 80-20, they added a 90-10. And we're reading the incrementality of, by adding another lean count, does that help you grow your business? I had a conversation with him last week. He goes, you know what? I used to promote 80-20 and my sales lift wasn't enough to offset my margin reduction. He goes, the 90-10 is all incremental margin. He said, I'm selling more of it. It's now half of the total category. So we've got another really strong piece of the story that we're putting together. We're going to continue to connect. The exciting part is Hy-Vee is going to roll this out system-wide the first week of April. So think about that, going from 35 stores to 300 stores. It's exciting. I mean, it's exciting. And we've got, you as pork producers have such a supporter in Hy-Vee. I mean, they're in pork production country. They do a great job. We're leveraging that with them. And we're going to expand. I mentioned the other retailers they're working with. And we'll continue to communicate this out. Kristen's here, so she's like on me all the time. Hey, do you have a story on ground pork? We're going to continue to build the stories. But the first one was getting the test and learn out of the way, proving that out, and now we can take it to the streets. Who wants to see what the merchandising is going to look like in store? So this is exciting. It's all about the food, right? It's how do you inspire that consumer. So you're going to have case dividers, big ones for the well, small ones for the smaller shelves. Hy-Vee is going to have 3x5 signs that will be on each shelf that will call out the cuts. You'll notice a QR code on that top one takes them to a collection of ground pork recipes. I've challenged our team at the National Pork Board. I want to robust our recipe collection. Ground pork's a big deal. We're going to continue to build out. And then the other ones are 7x11 signs. So if you think about when you've been in the grocery store and there's a sign in the case that you can see from both sides, that will be on there with those beautiful appetizing food shots. Egg roll in a bowl is one of my favorites, so that's why it's on there. And a QR code that takes the consumer to the recipe. And then just one other piece that we have done with ground pork, recreated these on-pack recipe labels. That labels are really inexpensive. I didn't think I wanted to be in the label business. I'm not in the label business, but when we've had 2 packers that have put them on their packages in the plant. One of them was Hormel because they did it for the Hy-Vee test. Another one's Premio, which is a processor out in the New Jersey area. Think about, I call them the Johnsonville of the Northeast, right? They're kind of a local sausage manufacturer, but we've had these recipe stickers in over 2,500 retail locations where we've shipped them to the stores. They put them on pack. We had a retailer in Arizona that said, you know what, rather than just putting them on ground pork, we're going to put them on all pork. I won't say the competitor, the packer whose brand was in that store, but they went from being number 6 to number 2. So they're like, it worked. We want to do more of it. And that packer now is working on putting that QR code on their physical product label. So when the consumer shop in the case, they can scan and get recipe labels or get recipe ideas. How'd I do on time? Oh, we got lots of time for questions. So that's it. That's the work that we're doing on ground pork. It's exciting. I think more to come. Stay tuned. It's a journey. We're just starting the journey, but it's exciting to see the progress that we've made and I'm excited to continue continue down the path on your behalf. I mean, I will tell you, it's an absolute pleasure to represent pork producers and do this kind of work. Questions? Marina, you got to have the first one. Nope, right there.
So in your work, have you had a chance to take a look at the presentation of the product itself, looking at the 1 pound tube or bigger as opposed to a tray with cellophane, and even break that out and further, going back up the case where you've got the, the concert, where it's taken off the tray and put in a wrapper? Has that got better value?
You know what we did? We looked at packaging. So we did a whole market landscape study coming into this, which that's another 50-deck slide that we could go into, but packaging was part of that. So the the product that's overwrapped on a foam tray, the consumer looks at that as it's fresh, it's made in the back of the store, and that's the best item. You can see the noodling, right? You can see it. I said the reality is the majority of that that's in the case today is case ready. So the consumer doesn't know that that's coming in from Tyson or Smithfield or JBS. They just think, oh, the butcher wrapped that, so it's fresher. So that represents probably almost 40%, right? That said that is the preferred packaging. Then you get into the chub, which the chub outside of the Midwest, people don't know what a chub is. I mean, you get too much further outside of this core Midwest region, there's not a lot of chub sold. Brick pack, so if you know what I'm talking about on a brick, it's a square, tight vacuum pack. If you think about a lot of the premium lamb, grass-fed beef, those type of items are in a brick pack. Those are big in the Northeast for pork. So if you think about some of the packers that are out there, whether it's Clemens with the Hatfield brand, JBS is in a brick pack. So consumers kind of identify with that. That is the least desired pack style, but it's also the easiest to put in the freezer, right? So there's kind of this, it just depends on how the packer processor is set up. And I don't know if that answered your question, but there was a lot of work around it. So one of our goals is, okay, let's get multiple lean contents, right? My ideal is 3. Have an 80-20, have an 85-15, and have a 90-10. But then I'd also like to get to the point where, like with beef, you can get a 1 pound, you can get a 3 pound, you can get a 5 pound. And you've got some retailers that are doing it in the service case. And most grinds that are in the service case are coming in chubs to the store, right? Whether it's beef or whether it's pork. It's a coarse grind, and then they're just doing a final grind in the back of the house. But the consumer identifies with that noodling as that's fresh, that's made fresh. So that's one thing. I will tell you, we've got 2 packers working on additional new items, right, based on the research. They've seen the opportunity, and they're like, yep, we just got to get labels through FSIS for approval. But, yeah, there was work done around packaging. Are we going to change the world overnight? No, but I will tell you that there's packers that weren't in the ground pork business that are looking to get into it, which is exciting. Other questions?
In Michigan the same as the one that's down like in Arizona?
It's not Fred in Michigan, it's just Meyer.
Okay.
And it's Meijer versus Meier. It's like my bologna has a first name, but so no, they're not related. But it's interesting as you start working with retailers, because like Meyer in Michigan they have a partnership with Fresh Time, right? I would have never from the outside looking in known that, but now we're having conversations with a packer around, hey, what are you doing with Fresh Time? And is there an opportunity to partner there? So it's a fascinating journey that we're on. And it's so fun to start seeing the results and the fruits of our labor. Other questions?
Did you look at price points at all?
We did look at price points, and I will tell you, we just completed another set of research around premium, right? And how does a consumer identify with premium? If you were in here on the sustainability talk that Dr. Crawford, one of the questions was, hey, are consumers willing to pay more for? One of the things that I've learned from consumers is they say one thing and they vote with their dollars a different way, right? And from past experience, right? Yeah, we want ABF, we want this, we want that. Whoa, it's going to cost that much more. I probably won't pay for it. There is an opportunity, and one of the critical parts as we get into more lean contents is having a tiered pricing approach, right? To ensure that we're not, you've got to give a reason for that consumer to purchase. And the other thing that we learned from the research, there's lots that we learned from the research. Consumers have specific items that they use specific lean contents for, right? 85 and 80s for burgers, 90% for dips and whatnot, and then 93% is, I can't remember off the top of my head what those are. So we've got to ensure that we continue to make that differentiation between lean content. But if nothing, the test that we've got going on with Meyer where he says, you know what, it's margin, it's incremental margin for me. That's a green light for a retailer, right? He's making more money. So we're helping him make more money, and he's pricing it at $5.99 versus $3.99. That's a good thing. The other thing that research showed is people will trade down one lean content, they won't trade down two. So if somebody's buying a 90, they might trade down an 85, they will not trade down to an 80. So that's the other disparity that we're talking to retailers about is make sure you bring the right items in to get that incrementality.
Can you talk about approaches to the larger chains like Walmart, Kroger, Publix?
As far as?
The same kind of thing you just talked about with Hy-Vee, but
Yep.
with the larger chains, because those are where more dollars are because of just people flow.
Absolutely. I've had conversation with Walmart. Tony Ribbles, the buyer, him and I dialogue all the time. We like to debate and banter on ground pork. Just because ground pork's a focus for us doesn't necessarily mean it's a focus for the retailer, but I will tell you, we have dialogue with Kroger, we're having dialogue with Albertsons, Publix is huge down in the southeast, we've done stuff with Winn-Dixie, we're working with Ahold Delhaize, which is in the top 5. They're out in the northeast, but you think about banners like Food Lion and Hannaford and Stop and Shop, so we wanted to be very methodical in how we took this out. We wanted to have the business case and be able to talk in that retailer's language. Now that we've got it, now we're just kind of prioritizing and saying, okay, where's the hit list and where do we go next? Walmart's a little tougher because they're willing to do stuff, but everything with a retailer comes at a price. The cool part about our partnership with Hy-Vee is this has all been, and I had Stephen, and I don't know if you're in the room, one of the state meetings, and I can't remember where it was, where a producer asked, did we pay for that shelf space? Right? And we didn't pay for the shelf space. Did we pay for the dividers? Yes. I will be transparent, the dividers cost $3,500 is what we invested in dividers for that test. So again, it's demonstrating if we can help save them money, make money, or save time, that's the language that we need to be talking with retailers. Another hand right there to your or to the left.
I'm sorry if you covered this already, but how do you keep the plant base then down further in the case, not having them creep back up to you?
I haven't verified it with a retailer. I think there's a lot of shrink in the fresh. And we've seen retailers where it's not in the fresh case anymore, it's in the freezer. And I will tell you, I visited with so many meat managers with this test with Hy-Vee, and they're like, yeah, we just keep a couple packages here because somebody might want to buy it. The rest of it's in the freezer, so it wasn't hard. I mean, there were a couple stores in Minneapolis where, you probably had more of that plant-based type consumer, but most stores, it wasn't hard to do it. And I think it's selling okay. I mean, again, we're not trying to propose that let's help you sell more plant-based. Let's just put it where that consumer's at, because it's not our consumer, so we don't need them down in our space. And I think, if you look at affinity and household penetration, I mean, there's been so much big equity money behind the plant-based. I mean, you can get anything in a retailer if you're willing to open a checkbook, right? I mean, if you pay slotting fees, retailers are going to do that. And I think what we saw was an over-proliferation of items, right? A retailer doesn't need 10 different plant-based items. My opinion, and again, this is not endorsed by the National Pork Board, my opinion is there will be a few brands that survive. I think it's still going to be a huge focus. But again, consumers vote with their dollars, and that's what we're trying to emphasize with the retailers. Other questions? Because I got all day. We do, and Fairway holds a special place. I worked at Fairway when I was in college. So I worked in the store in Centerville, Iowa, and I worked in Ames. Joyce from Iowa Pork. So Iowa Pork has a really strong relationship with Iowa Pork. I will tell you next week we have a call with Illinois Pork, Iowa Pork to talk about Fairway. So, and I know you've got Fairway right there in Stewartville. I love Fairway. They do a great job. They've got the frozen pork burgers in the case. They do a great job with brats. We've actually talked about having them come to our office in Des Moines and utilize our innovation kitchen to do some, brainstorming and looking at different cuts. They're a unique retailer. There aren't many retailers that are like Fairway because they've got the skilled labor, and that's retailers' biggest challenge today is that skill set of being able to break down a loin, break down a carcass that's a dying art. So Fairway is in a very unique position. I think there's some things that we can do with them. But yeah, Iowa Pork kind of drives that. But I still have my Fairway tie, and I still have my Fairway name tag that says 2 years of service. So
is there still, or have you cleared up the confusion with the consumer between fresh ground pork and ground sausage? Or is that confusion out there?
I don't know that it's out there. I think as we continue to give them more ideas, let's be honest, sausage isn't a problem. And we sell tons of ground pork. We have before we started down this road, right? Between brats and Jimmy Dean sausage and all of that, we've sold a lot. It's this idea of how do you just get them to buy unseasoned ground pork. All of the research that I showed, it's all based on unseasoned ground pork. That's what the focus was. So we'll continue to, if there's confusion with the consumer, we'll continue. My goal is, and I talked to a retailer down in the southeast, is how do you have a pop-up, like if I'm online, right, shopping on the app and I put ground beef in my cart, how do I have a pop-up that says, hey, ground pork's on sale this week, or here's a recipe for ground pork. So again, it's a journey, but it's a fun one to be on.